Have you ever thought about what it means to simply vanish? One moment you're walking down a familiar street with friends, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The next moment, you're gone. No trace, no body, no answers. Just empty air where a person used to be. And then imagine this. For 52 years, your family searches. They call hospitals, they check morgues, they follow leads that go nowhere. They dream about the sound of your voice, the way you laughed, the scar on your lip from when a dog bit you as a kid. 52 years of birthdays, 52 Christmases, 52 years of not knowing. This is not a hypothetical story. This is real. This is the story of Norman Prater, a 16-year-old boy who walked into the night in Dallas, Texas on January 14, 1973, and never came home. But this isn't just another unsolved missing persons case, because in January 2025, after more than half a century of silence, the mystery was finally solved. And the answer, the truth about what happened to Norman Prater, connects two tragedies separated by hundreds of miles and 6 months of time. This is the story of the longest-running missing persons case in Texas history. This is a story about a teenager caught in the chaos of the 1970s, a detective who refused to give up, and a brother who never stopped looking. You're listening to Hidden Chronicles. Hidden Chronicles isn't just a channel, it's a community of truth seekers. Join us by hitting subscribe, spread the word by sharing, and become part of the conversation in the comments below. Together, we uncover what's hidden. Welcome to the story of Norman Prater. To understand what happened to Norman Prater, we have to understand the world he lived in. And in 1973, that world was complicated in ways that are hard to imagine today. January 1973 was a pivotal moment in American history. Richard Nixon was president, but the Watergate scandal was unraveling his presidency day by day, thread by thread. The Vietnam War was winding down. The Paris Peace Accords would be signed on January 27th of that month, but the country was deeply divided, angry and exhausted by years of conflict that had torn families and communities apart. Young people didn't trust the government. Parents didn't understand their children. The generation gap wasn't just wide, it was a chasm. On the radio, you'd hear Roberta Flack singing Killing Me Softly, Elton John's Crocodile Rock, or Jim Croce's Bad Bad Leroy Brown. In movie theaters, The Godfather was still drawing crowds, and The Poseidon Adventure had people talking about disaster movies. Fashion was wild. Bell-bottoms, platform shoes, tie-dye, and denim everywhere. Hair was long for men and women alike. The counterculture movement that had started in the late 1960s was still going strong, though it was beginning to fade around the edges. Dallas itself was booming in 1973. Oil money was flowing through the city like a river. The Cowboys were becoming America's team, and downtown Dallas was transforming with new skyscrapers reaching toward the Texas sky. Business was good. The economy was strong, at least on the surface. But East Dallas, where Norman Prater lived, was a different story. It was a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where families lived paycheck to paycheck, where mothers worked night shifts at coffee shops and fathers worked construction or factory jobs. These were middle-income families doing their best to provide for their children, to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. It was a neighborhood where people knew each other, where kids played in the streets until the streetlights came on, where teenagers hung out at diners and parking lots because there wasn't much else to do. 16-year-olds in 1973 had freedoms that might shock parents today. Teenagers hitchhiked regularly. It was considered normal, even safe by many. They stayed out late without their parents panicking. They wandered the streets without cell phones to track their every movement. There was no GPS, no Find My iPhone, no way for parents to know exactly where their kids were at any given moment. If you wanted to find someone, you knocked on doors and asked around. You called friends on landlines. You waited and hoped they'd come home. There was no Amber Alert system. That wouldn't exist until 1996. There was no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That organization wouldn't be founded until 1984. There was no internet, no social media, no way to instantly blast a missing persons photo to millions of people. When a child went missing in 1973, families were largely on their own, dependent on local police who were often overwhelmed and under-resourced. But there was something else happening in Texas in 1973, something dark that would cast a long shadow over every missing teenager case in the state. Just 3 hours south of Dallas, in Houston, a serial killer named Dean Corll was in the middle of a murder spree that would eventually claim at least 28 young men and teenage boys, possibly more. Dean Corll was 33 years old in 1973. He worked as an electrician for Houston Lighting and Power. To his neighbors, he seemed like a nice guy, friendly, polite, well-liked. His family had run a candy factory, and Dean had a reputation for giving free candy to neighborhood kids, which earned him the nickname that would later chill people to the bone, the Candyman. Neighbors described him as a quiet, polite man who loved kids. Parents felt comfortable letting their children spend time around him. He seemed harmless, almost grandfatherly, despite being relatively young. But behind that smile was a monster of unimaginable cruelty. From 1970 to August 1973, Corll, with the help of 2 teenage accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, kidnapped, tortured, raped, and murdered dozens of teenage boys. Most were between 13 and 20 years old. Most came from working-class neighborhoods like the Houston Heights. Corll had a specific type: young, slender, often troubled boys who came from broken homes or were runaways. Boys who might not be immediately missed. Boys whose disappearances might be dismissed by police as just another runaway. And that's exactly what happened. When parents reported their sons missing, Houston police dismissed them. "Boys will be boys," they said. "He'll come home when he's ready." The chief of police even publicly stated that there was nothing they could do because running away wasn't illegal. Parents were told their sons might have just taken off, gone to California to join the hippies, or run off with a girlfriend. The police didn't want to hear about it. They didn't investigate. They didn't connect the dots, even though boys were disappearing at an alarming rate from the same neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Dean Corll kept killing. He had perfected his method. His teenage accomplices would lure victims to his house with promises of parties, drugs, or just a place to hang out. Once inside, the victims would be drugged, handcuffed to a plywood board that Corll had built specifically for this purpose, and then subjected to hours of torture before being strangled or shot. The bodies were buried in a boat shed that Corll rented at High Island Beach or near Lake Sam Rayburn. Some victims were never found. On August 8, 1973, 6 months and 3 weeks after Norman Prater vanished, the killing finally stopped. Elmer Wayne Henley, one of the Corll's accomplices, had brought a girl to Corll's house, which Corll violated. An argument ensued. Corll threatened to kill Henley and the other 2 teenagers present. In a moment that remains debated to this day, Henley grabbed Corll's gun and shot him 6 times, killing him instantly. When police arrived and Henley confessed, the world learned the horrifying truth. Bodies were everywhere. The boat shed in southwest Houston contained 17 bodies. More were found at High Island Beach, more at Lake Sam Rayburn. In total, 28 bodies were recovered, making it the worst serial killing case in American history at that time. Worse than the Boston Strangler, worse than Richard Speck, worse than anything Americans had experienced before.
The nation was horrified. How had this happened? How had so many boys disappeared without anyone noticing? How had police ignored the desperate pleas of parents? The Houston mass murders, as they became known, exposed deep flaws in how America dealt with missing children. It sparked conversations about runaways, about how police treated missing persons cases, about the vulnerability of teenage boys who were often dismissed as troublemakers rather than seen as potential victims. So when Norman Prater disappeared in January 1973, his family didn't just have their own fears to deal with. They had to wonder, Had their son somehow crossed paths with Dean Coral? Was Norman one of the victims who hadn't been found yet? It was a reasonable fear. Coral's primary hunting ground was Houston, but he traveled, he had a car, he was mobile. And one of his confirmed victims, Jeffrey Conan, was an 18-year-old who disappeared while hitchhiking from the University of Texas in Austin back to Houston in September 1970. Hitchhiking. The same thing many teenagers did in 1973, including possibly Norman Prater. The possibility haunted the Prater family. For years, decades even, they wondered if Norman was connected to the Candyman. Investigators looked into it. Norman's case file was compared to Coral's victim profile, but there was no definitive connection. Norman didn't fit the typical victim profile as closely. He was from Dallas, not Houston. There were no witnesses placing him in Houston, no evidence linking him to Coral or his accomplices. It remained a horrible possibility, but nothing more. The Prater family was left with questions, and a case that went colder with each passing year. But let's go back to that night, January 14th, 1973. It was just after midnight when Norman Prater walked into an all-night coffee shop in East Dallas, the kind of place with formica counters, worn vinyl stools, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the smell of burnt coffee and grease in the air. His mother worked there on the night shift. It was the kind of job that kept food on the table and paid the rent, but meant long hours, aching feet, and bone-deep exhaustion. Norman knew that, so he'd stop by sometimes just to say hello, grab a Coke, chat for a few minutes before heading home. It was a small gesture of connection in a busy life. That night, Norman wasn't alone. According to his mother's account, documented in the original missing persons reports and later in databases like the Charlie Project and NamUs, Norman came into the coffee shop with 3 other people, 2 teenage boys with shoulder-length hair whom she didn't recognize, and an older Hispanic man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, whom she knew by sight but didn't know personally. She had seen the man around the neighborhood before, had served him coffee perhaps, but they had never had a real conversation. She didn't know his name. Think about that detail for a moment. A mother at work, late at night, seeing her 16-year-old son with strangers. It's the kind of thing that might make you uneasy if you were watching from the outside, especially today. But in 1973, in that context, with that mindset, it probably didn't seem unusual or alarming. Teenagers hung out with other teenagers. Friends came and went. Your son's friends weren't always your friends. It was normal for kids to have social circles their parents didn't fully know. So Norman's mother didn't panic. She didn't pull him aside and demand to know who these people were. She served them, exchanged pleasantries, watched Norman order a soft drink. He chatted with his mother for a few minutes, casual conversation, nothing deep, nothing that would stick in memory as significant. Then he told her he was heading home. He even made plans to help her move the next day. They were changing apartments, going to a new place, and she needed his help with the heavy lifting, carrying boxes, moving furniture. "See you tomorrow, Mom," he said, or something close to that. We don't know his exact words. Those final words between a mother and son were not recorded anywhere, not written down, not preserved. But we know the essence of it, a casual goodbye, a promise to see each other soon, the kind of ordinary exchange that happens a million times a day between parents and children. Norman left the coffee shop sometime around 1:30 or 1 a.m., walking out into the cold January night. The 2 long-haired teenagers and the older Hispanic man left with him, or around the same time, and then nothing. That was the last time anyone in Norman Prater's family saw him alive. When Norman didn't show up the next day to help his mother move, she wasn't immediately worried, right? Teenage boys flake out sometimes. They oversleep, they forget their promises, they get distracted hanging out with friends and lose track of time. Maybe Norman had crashed at a friend's house and would show up later, apologetic and sheepish. So she waited. But when another day passed, and then another, the mild annoyance turned to worry, and worry turned to fear, and fear turned to action.
His mother called friends, knocked on doors, asked neighbors if they'd seen Norman. No one had. By January 14th, or possibly in the days immediately following, the family filed a missing persons report with the Dallas Police Department. The investigation began with the standard procedures of the time. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, going door to door with Norman's description and photo. They talked to friends from school, classmates who might have seen him recently. They checked hospitals. Maybe Norman had been in an accident and was lying unconscious in a hospital bed somewhere. They checked jails. Maybe he'd gotten into trouble and was locked up. They checked shelters and homeless encampments. Norman's description went out to teletype machines to other law enforcement agencies. White male, 16 years old, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, 145 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. Distinguishing marks included a scar on his lip from where a dog had bitten him as a child, and a scar on his eyebrow from a childhood fight or accident. He was last seen wearing jeans, a jacket, and sneakers, the uniform of American teenagers in 1973. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. No Norman. No body. No credible sightings. No leads that went anywhere productive.
The two long-haired teenagers from the coffee shop? Never identified. Detectives tried to find them, but in an era before security cameras, before social media, before digital trails, it was nearly impossible. If those boys didn't come forward voluntarily, if no one else recognized them from descriptions, they simply vanished into the anonymity of a big city. The older Hispanic man? Same story. Never found, never identified. He became a ghost in the investigation, someone who might have known something crucial or might have been completely innocent, just a customer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was like all four of them, Norman and his three companions, had stepped into a fog and disappeared. And here's where the story gets even more frustrating for anyone who cares about justice or closure. In 1973, there was no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That vital organization wouldn't be created until 1984, after the disappearance and murder of Adam Walsh. There was no nationwide database for missing persons that could be instantly searched and cross-referenced. There was no internet, no digital age, no way to instantly share information across state lines and jurisdictions. If a teenager went missing in Dallas and a body turned up 350 miles away in South Texas with no identification, there was no automatic system to connect those two dots. Unless someone specifically thought to check, unless someone made that phone call, unless someone had a hunch that connected cases A and B, those cases remained separate, filed in different cabinets in different cities, gathering dust as the years passed. And that's exactly what happened to Norman Prater. Because 6 months after he vanished from Dallas, something tragic happened on the Texas coast. Something that would remain unsolved and unconnected for 52 years. In July 1973, approximately 6 months after Norman disappeared, a body was discovered on Galveston Island. Galveston is a barrier island off the Texas coast, about 350 miles south of Dallas and just 50 miles from Houston. In 1973, it was a popular beach destination, a place where families vacationed, where college kids partied, where people went to escape the summer heat. But Galveston had a darker side, too. The beaches could be lonely at night, the Gulf waters could be unforgiving, and in the aftermath of Hurricane Carla and other storms, debris and occasionally bodies washed ashore. The body found in July 1973 was that of a young male, severely decomposed from months in the water, were buried in sand. The condition of the remains made identification nearly impossible with the technology available at the time. There were no fingerprints that could be lifted, the dental records that might have identified the victim were incomplete or didn't match anyone in the immediate area. There was no DNA testing. That technology wouldn't become available for forensic use until the mid-1980s and wouldn't be routinely used until the 1990s. So the body was logged as an unidentified John Doe, given a case number, and buried in a pauper's grave. Just another statistic. just another unsolved mystery. The case went cold. Meanwhile, in Dallas, the Prater family kept searching. Norman's mother never stopped hoping. His siblings wondered what had happened to their brother. Every time the phone rang, there was a moment of hope. Maybe this was the call saying Norman had been found alive. Maybe he'd been suffering from amnesia. Maybe he'd been kidnapped and had finally escaped. But that call never came. The years passed with agonizing slowness. The 1970s turned into the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. The 1990s became the 2000s. Norman's mother grew older. His siblings built their own lives, had their own families, but they never forgot Norman. They never stopped wondering. Norman's younger brother, in particular, became obsessed with finding answers. He checked missing persons databases as they became available online. He submitted DNA samples to genealogy websites. He contacted the Dallas Police Department regularly, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all. The answer was always the same. We're sorry, the case is still open, but we have nothing new to report. By the 2020s, Norman Prater's case had become the oldest unsolved missing persons case in Texas. 50 years, half a century. Most of the original investigators had retired or passed away. The physical case file had been transferred multiple times, from one records room to another, from paper to microfiche to digital scans. Witnesses had died or moved away. Memories had faded. It seemed like one of those cases that would never be solved, that would remain forever in the cold case files, a sad footnote in Texas criminal history. But then, something remarkable happened. In the early 2020s, advances in DNA technology and forensic genealogy began revolutionizing cold case investigations across America. Cases that had been unsolvable for decades were suddenly being cracked open. The Golden State Killer was caught after 40 years. Dozens of Jane and John Does were being identified through genetic genealogy, where DNA from unidentified remains is compared to DNA from genealogy websites like GEDmatch, 23andMe, and Ancestry.com. Investigators could now build family trees from DNA, tracing backward through generations to identify unknown individuals. In North Texas, the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office and the Dallas Police Department began looking at their coldest cases with fresh eyes and new tools. They started submitting DNA samples from unidentified remains to forensic genealogy companies. One of the cases they revisited was that unidentified body from Galveston Island in July 1973. The remains had been exhumed in previous years for DNA extraction, and that DNA profile had been entered into national databases, but there had been no match until now. In 2024 or early 2025, forensic genealogists working on the case uploaded the John Doe's DNA profile to a genetic genealogy database. The computer algorithms went to work, comparing millions of genetic markers, looking for family connections, and slowly, painstakingly, a family tree began to emerge. The DNA showed connections to certain family lines, certain surnames, certain geographic regions. Genealogists worked backward, building family trees from public records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries. They looked for families who had reported missing persons in the early 1970s. They looked for families with connections to both Dallas and the Texas coast, and one name kept appearing in the research: Prater. Could the unidentified body from Galveston Island be Norman Prater? The timing fit. Norman disappeared in January 1973, and the body was found in July 1973, approximately 6 months later. The location made sense. Galveston was only 50 miles from Houston, where the Dean Coral murders were happening, though investigators no longer believed Norman was a Coral victim. The physical description was consistent with what little remained of the body, but they needed confirmation. They needed to compare the DNA from the John Doe with DNA from Norman Prater's living relatives.
Norman's younger brother, who had never given up searching for his brother, was contacted by investigators. He agreed immediately to provide a DNA sample. The sample was collected, a simple cheek swab that took seconds, and sent to the lab for analysis. And then came the waiting. DNA comparison isn't instantaneous like it appears on TV shows. It takes weeks, sometimes months, for the analysis to be completed, for the genetic markers to be compared, for the statistical probability to be calculated. But when the results came back, they were definitive. The DNA from the John Doe found on Galveston Island in July 1973 matched the DNA from Norman Prater's brother. The statistical probability was overwhelming. This was Norman Prater. After 52 years, the longest-running missing persons case in Texas history was solved. The teenager who walked out of a Dallas coffee shop in January 1973 ended up dead on a beach 350 miles away 6 months later. On January 7, 2025, 52 years and almost 1 day after Norman was last seen alive, the Dallas Police Department and the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office held a press conference. Detective work by the North Texas investigative team had finally connected these two cases that had been separated for half a century. Norman Prater had been found. The news spread quickly. Fox 4 Dallas-Fort Worth reported the breakthrough. Other media outlets picked up the story. Social media lit up with discussions about the case. People who had never heard of Norman Prater learned his name for the first time. True crime communities dissected every detail. And in Dallas, Norman's surviving family members, now in their 60s and 70s, finally got the answer they had been searching for since 1973.
But the story doesn't end there, because now we have to ask the hardest questions. What happened to Norman Prater? How did he end up on Galveston Island? Who killed him, if anyone? Was it murder, accident, or something else? And this is where the story becomes frustrating again, because even with the identification confirmed, we still don't know the full truth. The physical evidence from 1973 is limited. The body was severely decomposed when found, making it difficult to determine cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma that survived decomposition, but that doesn't mean trauma didn't occur. Soft tissue damage, strangulation, drowning, poisoning. These things don't always leave marks on bones. The original investigation in Galveston was minimal because there was no way to identify the victim at the time. No witnesses came forward, no one reported seeing anything suspicious, so we're left with theories, educated guesses based on the evidence we have. Theory 1, the Dean-Corll connection. Even though Norman didn't fit the typical Corll victim profile perfectly, the timing and location are suspicious. Corll was actively killing in early 1973. Galveston is only 50 miles from Houston. Corll had a car and was known to travel. Some of his victims were found near water. Could Norman have somehow crossed paths with Corll or his accomplices? Could he have been an unconfirmed 29th victim? The problem with this theory is that Corll's accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, were extensively interrogated after Corll's death. They confessed to their roles in dozens of murders. They led police to burial sites. They identified victims. Neither of them ever mentioned Norman Prater. Neither of them ever described a victim matching Norman's description who was dumped in Galveston. And both of them had incentive to be honest. Their cooperation could lead to more lenient sentences. If Norman had been a Corll victim, it seems likely they would have mentioned it, but it's possible they forgot or kept some secrets even from investigators. Serial killers and their accomplices don't always tell the whole truth. Theory 2, the hitchhiking tragedy. Remember, Norman was last seen with 2 unidentified teenage boys and an older Hispanic man. What if they offered Norman a ride somewhere? What if Norman, like many teenagers in 1973, was hitchhiking, trying to get home from the coffee shop? What if those 3 men picked him up with bad intentions? The scenario could have unfolded like this. Norman accepts a ride. The car doesn't head toward his home. It heads south, toward Houston.
Galveston, toward the coast. Maybe Norman realizes something is wrong. Maybe he tries to escape. Maybe there's a confrontation. Maybe Norman is killed in the car or at a location near Galveston, and his body is dumped on the beach, left to be found or washed away by the tide. This theory fits the evidence we have. It explains how Norman got from Dallas to Galveston. It explains why those three men were never identified. They were the perpetrators, and they disappeared into anonymity. But it's just speculation. We don't know. Theory 3, the runaway scenario gone wrong. What if Norman wasn't murdered at all, at least not intentionally? What if he decided to run away from home that night, perhaps on a whim, perhaps after a fight with his parents we don't know about, perhaps because he wanted adventure or freedom, like so many teenagers in the 1970s? What if he caught a ride south, ended up in Galveston, and then something went wrong? Maybe he went swimming and drowned. Maybe he got involved with drugs and overdosed. Maybe he got into an accident. Maybe he was trying to start a new life and something tragic happened. The problem with this theory is that it doesn't explain why Norman would run away the night before he was supposed to help his mother move, after making specific plans with her. It doesn't explain why he never contacted his family again if he was alive. Most runaways, even in 1973, eventually reached out to let their families know they were okay. Norman never did. Theory 4, wrong place, wrong time. Perhaps Norman's death had nothing to do with the three men from the coffee shop. Perhaps he was the victim of a random crime, a robbery gone wrong, a sexual assault, a murder by a different killer we've never connected to the case. Texas in the 1970s had its share of violent crime. There were other unsolved murders. There were other dangerous people. Perhaps Norman simply encountered evil by chance, and that evil took his life. Without more evidence, we may never know which theory is correct. The case is officially closed in terms of identification. We know the John Doe from Galveston Island is Norman Prater, but the case remains unsolved in terms of what actually happened. Who killed Norman Prater? Where exactly did he die? Why was he in Galveston? These questions may never be answered. Most of the potential witnesses are likely dead. The physical evidence from 1973 is limited. The body was severely decomposed when found, making it difficult to determine cause of death. Memories have faded. The trail is too cold, even with modern technology. But here's what we do know, and this is important. Norman Prater was real. He wasn't just a case number, or a John Doe, or a statistic. He was a 16-year-old boy with hopes and dreams. He had a mother who loved him enough to work night shifts so he could have a better life. He had siblings who never stopped looking for him. He had friends who wondered what happened to him. He had a life that was cut short, violently and tragically, in 1973. For 52 years, he lay in an unmarked grave, unknown and unmourned except for his family. But now, finally, he has his name back. Now he can be properly buried with a headstone that bears his name, Norman Prater, 1956-1973. Now his family has closure, even if they don't have all the answers. And that matters. That's not nothing. In the world of cold cases and missing persons, identification is a victory. It's justice, even if it's not complete justice. The story of Norman Prater is a reminder of how far forensic science has come. In 1973, once a body decomposed beyond visual recognition, identification was nearly impossible. There were no computers, no national databases, no DNA testing. A John Doe could remain unidentified forever. But today, with genetic genealogy, with DNA databases, with advances in forensic anthropology and computer analysis, we can give names back to the nameless. We can bring closure to families who have waited decades. We can solve cases that once seemed unsolvable. Since 2018, genetic genealogy has helped identify hundreds of previously unidentified remains. Jane and John Does from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s are being identified every month. Families are getting answers, and that's extraordinary. But Norman Prater's story is also a reminder of the failures of the past. In 1973, when parents reported their teenage sons missing, police often didn't take it seriously. Boys were dismissed as runaways. Cases weren't properly investigated. Information wasn't shared between jurisdictions. And because of those failures, monsters like Dean Corll were able to operate for years. Families like the Praters suffered for decades. We've learned from those mistakes. Today we have Amber Alerts and Silver Alerts. We have the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We have databases like NamUs that connect missing persons cases with unidentified remains across the country. We take missing children seriously, regardless of whether they're runaways or abductions. But we still have work to do. There are still thousands of unidentified remains in America. There are still thousands of missing persons cases that haven't been solved. There are still families waiting for answers, just like the Praters waited for 52 years. So what's the lesson of Norman Prater's story? What should we take away from this case? I think there are several lessons. First, never give up. Norman's brother never stopped searching, never stopped checking databases, never stopped hoping for answers. And because he didn't give up, because he provided that DNA sample when asked, Norman was finally identified. Persistence matters. Second, technology changes everything. What was impossible in 1973 is routine in 2025. DNA can now speak for the dead. Science can solve mysteries that human investigators couldn't. We should invest in these technologies, fund these programs, and use these tools to their fullest potential. Third, every victim matters. Norman Prater wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He was just a regular kid from a working-class family. But his life had value. His death mattered. He deserved to have his name back. Every John Doe, every Jane Doe, every missing person deserves the same effort, the same resources, the same dedication to finding the truth. Fourth, time doesn't erase pain. 52 years is a lifetime. Norman's mother likely died without knowing what happened to her son, but his siblings lived with that pain for half a century, and when they finally got answers, that pain was still fresh, still real. Families of missing persons carry that burden forever. We should treat them with compassion, patience, and respect.
And finally, some mysteries may never be fully solved. We know what happened to Norman Prater in the end. He died, and his body ended up on Galveston Island. But we may never know the how or why. We may never know who killed him, if anyone. We may never know what he was doing in Galveston. And that's hard to accept. We want complete answers. We want justice. We want closure that feels final and absolute. But sometimes life doesn't give us that. Sometimes we get partial answers, and we have to be okay with that. Sometimes knowing a name is enough. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to remember Norman Prater, not as a cold case or a John Doe or a 50-year mystery. Remember him as a 16-year-old kid who walked into his mom's coffee shop one cold January night in 1973, ordered a Coke, made plans to help her move the next day, and then walked out into the darkness. Remember him as a son, a brother, a friend. Remember him as someone who mattered, because that's what Hidden Chronicles is about. Uncovering the stories that have been forgotten, giving voice to those who can't speak for themselves, and reminding ourselves that behind every cold case is a real person whose life had value. Norman Prater's case may be officially closed now, but his story will live on. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there knows something they haven't shared yet. Maybe someone remembers those two teenage boys with long hair from the coffee shop. Maybe someone remembers that older Hispanic man. Maybe someone has information that could finally answer the last remaining questions. If that's you, if you know anything about what happened to Norman Prater in January 1973, please contact the Dallas Police Department. Even after 52 years, the truth still matters, justice still matters, and Norman's family still deserves complete answers. This has been the story of Norman Prater, 52 years of silence and the breakthrough that finally brought him home. Thank you for listening to Hidden Chronicles. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please subscribe to our channel, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement keeps these stories alive and helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths that deserve to be told. Until next time, remember, every person has a story, and every story deserves to be heard.